Naomi's pulse thrummed against her ears as she slowed her pace, noticing how the men spread out in a loose semicircle. Their eyes glinted with something between desperation and cruel amusement. She was no stranger to fear, but hers was a focused edge, not the blind panic they expected. By the way, she was black, wiry muscles and a steady gaze that had disarmed threats bigger than these men. It was a simple fact of her life, never something she felt the need to hide or highlight. "Hey there," one of them growled, lips curling into a grin. His shirt was torn, and bruises marred his forearms. "Mind helping us out?" Naomi paused, exhaling slowly. She didn't want to fight. She'd spent enough of her lifetime trading punches in foreign deserts and dense jungles. But the tension in the air told her they wouldn't leave without trying to force her compliance. She offered no answer, keeping her stance relaxed but poised, as if inviting them to underestimate her. A second man, tall and hollow-eyed, took a step forward. "You alone out here?" he asked. His accent was hard to place, but the menace in his tone was universal. Naomi eyed him quietly, taking in every detail: scuffed boots, clenched fists, a hidden blade tucked behind his belt. Her mind flickered with strategies. She could distract them, twist their leader's ego against him, get them arguing before they realized what was happening. She allowed herself a half-smile. "I'm just out for a run." Their leader smirked. "Then keep running." He nodded to his companions, and two of them flanked her. "Unless you'd rather stick around and help us. We could use a guide." Naomi glanced at the men's shifting eyes. They thought they'd found an easy pawn to drag into whatever scheme they had planned. She could practically taste their arrogance. And she could use it against them. "All right," she said, pretending to sound resigned. She edged closer to the tall man, stepping just inside his reach. "But you won't get far in this forest." He reached out to seize her arm, and Naomi struck. In a heartbeat, she twisted his wrist and drove her elbow into his rib cage. The dull thud of impact made another convict flinch. A sharp cry tore from the tall man's lips as he dropped to his knees. Someone cursed. Another man lunged at her with a clumsy swing. Naomi ducked and sidestepped, letting him stagger past. She shot out a foot, catching him behind the ankle. He fell face-first onto damp leaves. "I'm giving you one chance to walk away," Naomi said, her voice steady as she pivoted. Her pulse raged like a war drum, but her outward calm betrayed no hint of hesitation. "Turn around. Find someplace else to hide." Scarred faces and hungry eyes glared at her. One man, older and grizzled, spat on the ground. "We ain't going anywhere without you." Naomi noted the flicker of uncertainty spreading among them. Two were already nursing injuries, and the older one's bravado seemed thin. She realized they weren't a cohesive unit but a ragtag bunch driven by raw desperation. It would be easy enough to sow confusion among them. "Fine," she replied, shifting her stance. "Let's see how far you get." Then she turned and dashed into the forest. They hesitated only a second before charging after her, snapping branches and swearing with every stride. Naomi moved like a shadow, ducking around wide oaks, vaulting over exposed roots. Her breathing was controlled, her eyes scanning for the best route to lead these men astray. A cluster of dense pine loomed ahead, and Naomi dove between the trunks. Dappled light played tricks on the eyes here, perfect for losing pursuers. Behind her, she heard stumbling and muffled curses as her pursuers crashed clumsily through the brush. She wasn't running from them. She was leading them deeper, where her advantage grew with every step. They thought she was merely trying to escape. In reality, she was setting the stage for the conflict they had unknowingly invited. Naomi slowed just enough to let them glimpse her figure between the trees. She wanted them to keep chasing, to remain confident they could corner her again. She felt her muscles burn, a familiar sensation that told her she was alive and in control. Adrenaline surged through her veins as she recalled old lessons about ambush tactics, escape routes, and how to turn an enemy's aggression against him. The forest would be her ally. Their arrogance was the real hostage. They believed that catching her would be a simple matter of persistence. She was only one person and they were several, driven by raw adrenaline and the grim incentive of freedom. Yet Naomi Carter moved through the wilderness as if every hill, hollow, and winding path had once belonged to her alone. Dense evergreens towered overhead, their interwoven crowns filtering sunlight into patches of dappled gold. Twisted roots and scattered undergrowth formed a challenging maze, but she slipped past obstacles with uncanny ease. Her pursuers, on the other hand, trampled over broken branches and crinkling leaves, each noise betraying their impatience. The escapees advanced, occasionally calling to one another in sharp, hushed voices. Their words carried an edge of frustration that grew louder whenever they thought they saw her silhouette dart between the mossy trunks. They expected to corner her swiftly and drag her back like a trophy, a living shield against whatever search parties might be on their trail. Yet the forest conspired with Naomi, providing endless nooks for concealment. She navigated the rugged terrain with silent determination. A cluster of ferns concealed a sunken trail that curved along a row of boulders. Naomi dipped into that path, crouching low so her pursuers would lose sight of her. One man shouted that he'd spotted movement, prompting the others to surge ahead. They barreled into the boulders, scanning the area with wary eyes, but they found only trailing vines and dripping water. Naomi observed from behind a fallen tree, measuring their reactions. Their bravado persisted, but some portion of their confidence had evaporated. A tense argument flared when they realized they had lost her trail again. One pointed to a set of footprints pressed into soft soil, but the tracks led nowhere. Naomi knew how to mask her path. A quick drag of her heel, a subtle brush of leaves, anything to break the continuity of her prints. Each small trick compounded their sense of being outsmarted. They decided to set a simple trap, splitting around a clearing circled by thick pines. If Naomi stepped into that clearing, they planned to converge and pin her down. She waited until they positioned themselves before circling around to a vantage point on a slight incline. From there, she lobbed a small stone at a trunk. The crack drew every gaze, and the men rushed inward, expecting her to burst into view. By the time they realized she wasn't there, they had wasted precious energy and sown more anger among themselves. Naomi took advantage of that anger. She let them glimpse her again, this time a brief flicker of motion as she ducked into a thicket of blackberry brambles. Pursuit followed, but they cursed and stumbled when they met the thorny barricade. Scratches and stained fabric did little to improve their morale. Meanwhile, she had already found firmer ground and moved toward a ridge where ancient trees clung to the rocky slope. Her plan was to draw them deeper, exploiting unfamiliar footholds and unstable ledges. The route turned uneven, studded with boulders and hidden gullies. Each patch of loose gravel could become a threat to the untrained. Naomi climbed with care, untroubled by the challenge. Her footing was deliberate. She had learned to test each step. Behind her, the convicts attempted to keep pace. One nearly lost his balance on a slippery rock face. Another swore loudly after snagging his foot in a tangled root. The forest amplified every mistake, echoing their curses into the thick canopy, as though mocking their clumsy progress. Naomi pressed on, checking over her shoulder to ensure that they maintained their relentless pursuit. A sudden shout signaled that one of them had spotted her again, and she darted across a narrow ledge that overlooked a deep ravine carved by centuries of rushing water. She felt the wind swirl through the crevasse, stirring leaves in a small whirlwind. The ground here was fragile, held by crooked roots and eroded stones. Naomi pressed a hand against a trunk to balance herself, moving swiftly towards safer ground. The convict behind her misjudged his approach. Eager to close the distance, he lunged forward without testing the rocky surface. A crunch echoed beneath his boots. Naomi heard the splintering sound of stones giving way. She leaped clear, watching in her peripheral vision as he slipped, arms flailing against the empty air. A terrified cry erupted before his voice vanished into the gulf. The others scrambled to the edge, staring in horror. The final glimpse of their comrade was the dull impact far below. Shock rippled through them, pulling them out of their tunnel vision pursuit. Their illusions about the forest and about Naomi shattered in that instant. No mere runner could navigate these treacherous paths with such precision. They were witnessing a deliberate strategy, executed by someone who understood how to maneuver in hostile territory. Whispers and urgent gestures signaled their alarm. One tried to blame the dead man's foolishness, but the others seemed less certain. They muttered that she must have set them up, drawn them here. Perhaps she had known all along that the ridge would crumble under the slightest pressure. True or not, the suspicion took hold in their minds, eroding unity. The man who appeared to be their leader stared at the spot where the ground had broken away. Anger twisted his features, but there was something else in his eyes, an edge of respect for her lethal capabilities. He ordered them to regroup and search systematically, though his own voice trembled. They set off again, more cautiously than before, eyes darting to every rock and tangle of brush. Naomi, hidden behind a knot of thick roots at a higher vantage, watched them shuffle past. She sensed their fear. The momentum now belonged to her. They had discovered the difference between an untrained target fleeing in terror and a skilled adversary who chose every route with deliberate care. Slowly, they drifted out of sight, venturing even deeper into the labyrinth she guided them through. She exhaled, letting herself savor a moment of calm. A soft ache pulsed through her legs, but a quiet determination burned brighter. These intruders were learning that the advantage lay not just in numbers or weapons, but in one's mastery of the environment. They had assumed the forest was just another obstacle. They were beginning to realize it was her territory, not theirs. Though they had lost a man, none of them seemed inclined to retreat. Pride and desperation mingled, driving them forward despite the unfolding dangers. Naomi recognized the signs. They would keep fighting to reclaim the illusion of control, unaware that every trap they stumbled upon was another piece of a carefully composed plan. She moved away from the ridge, ever alert for the sounds of snapping branches or muffled curses that would mark their location. Her mind spun with possibilities, each path through the undergrowth offering a new snare. The forest offered infinite permutations of risk, from precarious drop-offs to concealed ravines. She only needed to guide them to the next critical point, and their stubborn pride would do the rest. A quick glance at the ravine behind her reminded her how fragile life could be in that domain. One slip was all it took. She whispered a silent pledge to remain sure-footed. Then she vanished into the shadows, determined to ensure that the convicts realized the peril of chasing someone who knew every leaf and every hidden trail. They pursued her still, but with heavier steps and guarded expressions. Uncertainty gnawed at them, and that uncertainty was exactly what she needed. She would wait for the opportune moment, perhaps another vantage high above them. From there, she could steer them like pieces on a board, letting their frustration grow until it twisted into sheer panic. This hunt was no simple flight for survival. It was a test of will and cunning. On one side, prisoners certain they could outlast or overpower a lone adversary. On the other, Naomi Carter, a tactician who wielded the forest as her silent partner. Their world had narrowed to hushed breaths, snapping twigs, and the knowledge that she was somewhere ahead, always beyond reach, leading them toward an inevitable reckoning. Naomi Carter sensed a shift in the convicts' tactics when scattered shouts and hurried steps echoed in multiple directions. They were splitting up, convinced that covering more ground would corner her faster. She could almost feel their confidence rising as they trampled through undergrowth and snapped twigs under heavy boots. In their minds, numbers still tipped the balance in their favor, even if they chose to divide themselves. They did not realize how much advantage they handed over by letting her isolate them in smaller groups. She crouched behind a fallen trunk, allowing the thick moss and knotted roots to cloak her presence. One cluster of fugitives, led by a man with a scar that zigzagged across his right cheek, stomped past. They glanced around but did not see her, and she studied their posture and weaponry from her hiding spot. She could pick out a handgun stuffed in a pocket, a hunting knife hanging loosely from a belt loop, and raw desperation in each expression. They murmured to each other about the need to find her quickly. She waited, letting them believe she was running in circles. A short while later, two of them veered left through a patch of overgrown bushes while the scar-faced one and his partner continued in another direction. Another convict wandered alone, trying to keep an eye on the two splintered teams, though he was clearly struggling with the reality of navigating these dense woods. Naomi selected him as her first target. She kept low, shadowing him. His panting grew louder as he picked his way over uneven ground. He paused by a stand of young saplings, scanning for footprints or broken branches. When he bent down to inspect a possible clue, Naomi sprang forward, delivering a fast blow to the base of his skull with a closed fist. He crumpled to his knees, gasping, and she seized his collar, pulling him behind a wall of ferns before he could shout for help. A quick search of his pockets revealed no gun, only a worn folding knife and a few scraps of paper. She left him dazed on the forest floor, not wasting time to tie him up. A conscious prisoner was too great a risk if the others regrouped. She melted back into the foliage, allowing the convict to stagger to his feet and stumble away, already losing track of where he had been. Her aim was not to be a ghost forever. She wanted them to know she was there, that each random noise or passing shape in the corner of their eyes might be her. Fear and uncertainty would sap their will faster than any direct confrontation. She caught the sound of one of the pears crunching through dead leaves, so she moved in that direction. This time, she concealed herself behind thick, tangled vines and waited for the right moment to strike. The men were bickering. One insisted they needed to regroup, while the other refused, saying their best chance was to keep the net wide. Their volume rose as frustration spilled out, and that gave Naomi the cue to distract them. She tossed a small stone at a nearby tree, letting it bounce off the bark with a sharp crack. The pair whirled around, cursing. Naomi dashed from her concealment, ramming her shoulder into one man's back. He lurched forward and collided with his partner. Before either could turn around, she disappeared among the vines again. Footsteps thudded as they lunged after her, but the undergrowth swallowed them, and they found nothing but shifting leaves. She heard one growl that they needed to be more careful. The fear in his voice told her they were beginning to grasp the danger of this terrain. She left them there, struggling through the twisting labyrinth, and moved on to locate another group. The strategy she employed was simple but effective: strike without warning, vanish before they could retaliate, keep them off balance, and never let them find an organized front. Every rustling branch could be a threat, every shifting shadow a sign of her presence. She knew how minds unraveled under that pressure. Soon enough, she heard a startled yelp far off to her right. Another convict had stumbled upon something unexpected. She crept closer, ears attuned to the clang of loose dirt and broken twigs. A pit lay hidden beneath vines and leaves, an old trap left behind, or perhaps a natural sinkhole that Naomi had noticed earlier. Inside it, a man writhed, arms thrashing as he attempted to pull himself out of a 6-foot drop. The walls were loose soil mixed with rocky fragments, making it difficult to climb. She peered over the edge, observing him. He looked up, eyes full of fury and panic. He recognized her outline and reached for a pistol at his belt, but it was gone, perhaps lost during his fall. Naomi descended partway, keeping her distance and an escape route ready. "You?" he snarled, voice echoing in the confined space. "You planned this?" He shifted unsteadily, trying to find a foothold. Naomi's voice remained low and calm as she demanded answers. Where were they going? Why risk so much for an escape route through treacherous woodland? He spat back defiance at first, claiming he had no idea what she meant. Naomi responded by narrowing her eyes and hinting she already knew about an abandoned house near the forest edge, a place rumored to be a rendezvous point for criminals on the run. That suggestion, combined with the hopelessness of his situation, cracked his resolve. He confessed that a contact was waiting at the house, someone who would supply new clothes, forged documents, and maybe even a vehicle to slip beyond any checkpoints. "When we get there, we're clear," he muttered through clenched teeth. "Nobody's gonna stop us. We have connections." Naomi let him believe she might help him out of the pit. She instead pulled a strip of cloth from his own tattered shirt, using it to bind his wrists tightly behind his back. He resisted, but a quick twist of his arm robbed him of any will to fight. She took extra care to gag him, preventing shouts that might attract his companions. A faint ripple of voices in the distance warned that others were converging on the sound of their allies' fall. Naomi grabbed a thick root and hoisted herself out of the pit, ignoring the convict's muffled protests. She left him there, pinned by gravity and the tight binds that cut into his wrists. A final glance over the edge showed his furious eyes tracking her every motion, but there was nothing he could do. She vanished into the foliage with the same speed she had displayed earlier, not bothering to look back. Shouts erupted as at least 2 men stumbled onto the trap from above. She heard them scramble around, cursing when they spotted their captured comrade. Their anger rose, but she was already gone. The forest closed around her, branches swaying in a faint breeze that carried echoes of frustration. She felt her pulse steady as she traveled deeper, absorbing the new piece of intelligence about the abandoned house. Reaching that location before the fugitives regrouped might be the key to shutting down whatever plan they had devised. There was no time to waste. Her footsteps were light and measured, leaving minimal trace for anyone hoping to track her. She would remain the invisible enemy they feared until the final confrontation forced them to see her face again. They trudged through a stretch of undergrowth, cursing at each unexpected twig snap, each subtle noise filtering through the dense canopy. Their nerves had frayed after the pursuit of a ghostly adversary who struck without warning and vanished just as swiftly. Their plan was to regroup where they had last heard one of their own shouting in panic. A few bitter exchanges flared among them, each blaming the other for failing to stay together. Eventually, they arrived at the spot where a bound accomplice had been left behind. They expected to rescue him, but instead they found his lifeless form slumped against a tree trunk, ropes still coiled around his wrists. His eyes stared blankly at the underbrush. At first glance, it looked as if he might have taken a fatal stumble that tightened the binds around his neck. A shard of jagged rock lay near his feet, as though he had smashed his head in a desperate attempt to free himself. Yet the sight felt disturbingly off. A silence hung in the air, broken only by the crackle of leaves under shifting feet. One of the convicts knelt and touched the cold skin, brow creasing as he realized there was no chance this was an innocent accident. A low growl escaped their self-appointed leader, the one who had kept them moving forward through every grim turn. This time, though, his jaw clenched and a flicker of doubt crossed his eyes. Another man drew back, muttering that they should abandon their mission before they all ended up in shallow graves. The leader refused, spitting out that turning back was impossible and that their only chance at slipping away from any pursuit or search parties lay deeper in the woods. His words carried less force than before, revealing threads of desperation. Yet he still managed to glare down anyone who questioned him. They argued for a while, voices rising and echoing between the gnarled trunks, until the leader won by sheer force of will. Surrender felt unthinkable, so they forced themselves to believe that pressing on might yield a better result than retreating. They carried what supplies they had left in tattered packs, but when they stopped to try and organize, they realized some items were missing. Cans with food had been punctured, water containers cracked and drained. A few spare clothes were slashed to ribbons. At first they suspected an animal, but then they noticed a pattern in the destruction. Each ruined piece felt deliberate, as if someone had crept into their belongings and hacked them apart with cold precision. Before they could properly take stock, one of them noticed a mark carved into a broad oak, a single slash crossing a circle that dripped with wet bark residue. It looked crudely made, yet intimidating, an unmistakable sign of a hostile presence. More symbols appeared on nearby trunks, carved at eye level. They formed a trail of grim warnings, each new mark intensifying the group's paranoia. No one saw Naomi Carter while this sabotage took place. She lurked beyond flickers of shadow, tearing open cans of provisions and dumping precious water onto the soil. At intervals, she crept through the maze of roots, carving ominous symbols into the thick bark. Her aim was not just to keep them hungry and thirsty, it was to unsettle them, to remind them they were never safe. Their disjointed attempts to track her grew more frenzied, spurred by a sense of inevitability bearing down on them. They stumbled in circles, lured by footprints that dissolved into nothing, by broken sticks that pointed them in misleading directions, and by the echo of stones clacking together in the distance. At every turn, they expected to catch a glimpse of her face or hear her voice, but they found only more confusion. Time lost meaning in the thick woodland, and weariness gnawed at their minds. As tension mounted, someone snapped. He tore off into the darkness, screaming Naomi's name, hurling curses at every rustle of leaves. The others yelled for him to come back, but he vanished among the twisted trunks and creeping vines. Arguments sprang up again. Some demanded they form a search party for him, while others insisted they should fortify a single spot and wait for any chance to regain strength. The leader wavered, torn between chasing after the lost man and holding ground. In the end, they stumbled through the shadows in a half-hearted search, calling out in voices that trembled beneath their forced bravado. They had no idea if Naomi lurked a few paces away, or if she listened from a vantage point in the trees. Eventually, their shouts sank into reluctant silence, and the forest seemed to mock them with rustling branches and fleeting shapes. When they finally caught sight of the missing man, it was too late. He was sprawled at the base of a gnarled cedar, limbs contorted as though he had been dragged. A dark line cut across his throat, and the ground beneath him was stained with what had spilled from that fatal wound. There was no noise around him, no sign of a struggle except for a deep gouge in the cedar's bark and broken twigs scattered in strange patterns. One convict retched at the sight, staggering backward with shaking hands. Another let out a horrified gasp, eyes darting everywhere, as though expecting Naomi to be standing a few feet away. No one said a word about leaving now. The unspoken terror was that they might not survive even if they tried to retreat. Their leader, though visibly shaken, clenched his fists so tightly that they trembled from the strain. A smoldering anger replaced his previous uncertainty. His face contorted into a mask of fury as he promised vengeance. In that moment, he seemed ready to condemn his entire group to a final clash rather than accept defeat. This was precisely the effect Naomi had engineered. A toxic brew of fear, rage, and desperation. She watched from within the tangle of branches and vines, unseen by those who scoured the area for any hint of her. Her handiwork had sown the chaos she needed. Supplies were in tatters, water was running short, and the men were too terrified to think coherently. She trusted they would continue stumbling through the labyrinth of false trails, each step drawing them closer to further calamities. She had no illusions about the violence these convicts could still unleash if cornered, but she also knew that panic corroded rational thought. Observing them now, she saw the seeds of collapse germinating, fueled by exhaustion and overshadowed by the sense of an enemy who refused to be pinned down. She withdrew deeper, letting the darkness swallow her silhouette. They would do the rest of the work themselves, stumbling from one self-inflicted miscalculation to the next. And she, ever watchful, ever ready, would remain a presence just beyond their reach, shaping their fate with each deliberate act of psychological warfare. The group had shrunk once more, leaving fewer faces around the scattered embers of lost pride. Each confrontation with Naomi Carter eroded their numbers and fueled the creeping suspicion that they had wandered into the domain of a merciless predator. Now, those who remained trudged through the tangle of branches and uneven ground with a constant tension in their steps, eyes darting at every rustle of leaves. They carried a mixture of terror and anger, determined to press forward but haunted by the knowledge that their adversary blended into the shadows at will. One of them, a heavy-set man with a ragged jacket, cursed under his breath about the lack of food and drinkable water, blaming their leader for not turning back when they had a chance. The leader snarled in return, brandishing a battered pistol to assert his authority. But the more they argued, the clearer it became that fear was fracturing their unity, reducing them to frantic souls wandering a place that felt like a labyrinth. Their path crossed a dense thicket of twisted shrubs and creeping vines. Naomi had scouted that section of forest earlier, discovering a spot where sharpened branches had cracked naturally in a wicked pattern, pointed like daggers. By lashing them together and fixing them under tension, she devised a trap triggered by an almost invisible tripwire. The group, oblivious, trudged right into it, led by a foolhardy convict who stomped ahead as if brute force could ward off any threat. His foot snagged on the filament, releasing the branches with a violent snap. They struck him at chest level, the barbed tips driving into flesh with sickening force. His cry pierced the hush of the wilderness, echoing until it tapered into a pained gurgle. The others jerked back, too horrified to react, watching as he crumpled to the ground in a contorted mass. The sight burned into their minds that Naomi was no fleeting apparition. She was a hunter, and the forest was her accomplice. Those who remained stared at the spattered remnants of their companion, fear gripping them with a choking hold. A man with a scar across his chin muttered something about not moving another step until they figured out a new plan. Another trembled, shifting his gaze in every direction. Their leader stood rigid, fists clenched, until at last he ordered them to retreat from that area. They pulled back, but not without the crawling realization that Naomi could spring such devices anywhere. Indeed, the mere possibility of more traps scattered across the wilderness made them hesitant to travel. Even so, staying put invited the possibility of a silent approach and a quick end they might never see coming. Caught between the horror of moving and the dread of staying, they tried to find a middle ground, establishing a rudimentary camp near a clearing dotted with pine stumps. They gathered what meager supplies remained, building a fire that cast flickering light on their haggard faces. While they huddled, Naomi observed from a vantage point behind knotted roots. She watched them drop their guard as exhaustion took hold, fueling illusions that a campfire would repel danger. Once they drifted into restless sleep, she emerged. With careful steps, she snuck around the perimeter, sprinkling flammable fluid on the tinder they had amassed for the next round of flames. A single spark from a lighter in her hand turned their sight into a roaring blaze that consumed battered tents and scattered provisions. The convicts jolted awake in a panic of light and heat, stumbling away from the inferno with shouts. One man attempted to smother the flames, but the flickering tongues grew too fast, devouring anything in reach. In their desperation, the men scattered again, leaving behind the last fragments of normalcy they had tried to create. Shrouded by confusion, Naomi melted into the darkness, following the path of one convict who had broken off from the others in a frantic dash. His breath came in ragged bursts as he tripped over fallen branches, occasionally pausing to glance back at the fiery glow. Convinced he was alone, he took shelter beneath a mossy overhang of rock, curling up to catch what scraps of rest he could. His nerves had frayed to the point where adrenaline could no longer keep him alert. Sleep claimed him with harsh inevitability. Naomi approached with measured calm, a silent shape stepping through the gloom. She could see the tremble in his limbs even in unconsciousness, the reflection of agony and terror etched into his features. She knelt beside him, pressing one hand to his mouth to stifle a final cry. With an arm coiled around his neck, she squeezed until his body convulsed. Her voice, barely a whisper, cut through the hush with a single sentence, "You never should have touched me." In moments, the struggling ceased and he lay still. The remains of the camp still glowed in the distance. Flames flickered like a demonic beacon in the midst of the forest's vastness, a testament to Naomi's relentless mission to drive these men to the brink. She lifted her gaze from the motionless figure at her feet, scanning for any sign of movement among the tree trunks. No silhouettes emerged, no fresh commotion broke the hush. She faded away from the scene, leaving behind only the evidence of her presence. Another life snuffed out, another silent warning carved into the battered soil. The cycle continued. The group was dwindling, morale was eroding faster than any hope of salvation. Each step they took deeper into this realm fed her advantage, entangling them further in a macabre dance they had begun yet never anticipated ending quite like this. Their illusions about controlling the chase had already crumbled, replaced by the chilling realization that Naomi Carter stood firmly in command, orchestrating every lethal step. She pressed onward, methodically ensuring no trace of her lingered behind beyond the smoldering debris. Any footprints she might have left, she erased with a brush of pine needles or a swift sweep of her boot. The forest was her cloak, and she intended to keep it that way. Far away, the convicts who remained would eventually find the body of their companion, but by then, they would be even more scattered and weakened. In every direction, Naomi had planted the seeds of dread, leaving them uncertain whether a trap waited around the next bend or if she herself lurked behind the next trunk, ready to strike again. She thrived on their fear, not for the sake of cruelty, but as a calculated tool to ensure they paid for underestimating her and for violating her space. Meanwhile, the few survivors regrouped in a splintered attempt at unity. Their leader tried again to rally them, yet every command dripped with doubt. One man suggested a frantic charge toward the old abandoned house they had mentioned before, hoping that rushing their final goal might grant them some advantage. Another proposed they find a water source and fortify themselves, forcing Naomi to engage on their terms. But not one of them believed she would simply blunder into any fair fight. She had led them into too many disasters already, demolishing their sense of control. So they trudged on, battered physically and emotionally, deeper into the labyrinth that she manipulated with precision. Their animosity for their unseen foe rose in tandem with the gnawing realization that they were being herded like prey. Naomi followed at a distance, counting their heads, measuring each new bout of weakness or dissension. She was not finished with them. Each step they took brought them closer to the edge of her carefully orchestrated campaign, and she would be there when they arrived, ready to show them why no intruder should ever dare to underestimate Naomi Carter. 8 fugitives had once trudged these woods, but only 3 remained. Weariness and dread clung to them like a second skin, each step tainted by uncertainty. Their leader, a man called Vinny, surveyed the dwindling group with grim determination. His face was bruised and his clothes were torn, yet his voice still carried that commanding bite. The others looked to him for direction, though the fear in their eyes betrayed how close they were to breaking. A hush stretched over the forest. The men glanced around, half expecting Naomi Carter to lunge out of the shadows. Vinny gritted his teeth, fully aware that they were trapped in her domain. She had picked them off one by one, orchestrating their downfall with uncanny precision. He sensed that continuing forward would lead them deeper into her snare, but retreat was equally perilous. Each new scheme she deployed suggested she knew this terrain intimately, and each fresh loss reminded him that his numbers, and luck, were running out. He studied his 2 remaining partners and recognized their fraying nerves. One was a wiry fellow with a bad limp, the other had a bandaged forearm clotted with dried blood. They were worn down, but they still clutched weapons and a flicker of rage. He saw the fragile alliance in their posture, how they instinctively kept distance from each other, unwilling to trust. Vinny understood he needed something drastic to turn the tide. With only 3 left, the usual tactics of searching or evading held no promise. She was too methodical, too adept. He decided to go all in, to expose himself as bait, hoping to lure her out. He addressed them in a low voice, explaining that if he stood in the open, Naomi might feel emboldened to attack. The others would then have a chance to ambush her. Desperation glinted in his eyes. They both nodded, a shaky sense of agreement passing between them. Anything seemed better than continuing as mindless prey. So Vinny planted his feet in a patch of ground free from thick vegetation, scanning the surrounding trunks for any sign of movement. The other 2 took positions behind gnarled roots, each holding a firearm. Their plan hinged on Naomi striking at him first, but even they knew how risky that was. Somewhere within the shelter of leaves and shadows, Naomi watched with quiet focus. She recognized the shift in strategy. Vinny presented himself boldly, yet his eyes roved constantly, scanning for any flicker of motion. He was using himself as the lure, expecting her to dive at the opportunity. A faint smile pulled at the corner of her mouth. She had faced such tactics before. She knew better than to rush a well-laid trap. Instead, she observed the clearing carefully, spotting the 2 men hidden among twisted roots and rotting logs. She decided to turn their own plan against them. Rather than approach the clearing, she made a calculated choice to reveal herself fleetingly on the opposite side. A glimpse of her silhouette was enough to spark immediate gunfire from the concealed convicts. They roared with frustration, bullets punching into the undergrowth, striking nothing but bark and soil. This gave Vinny the impression that his trap was working, so he gestured for the shooters to spread out and keep up the pressure. Yet in redirecting their focus, Naomi guided them away from their original vantage points, nudging them closer to a path that would lead them to a turbulent stretch of river. She maneuvered quietly through tangles of vine and fern, careful not to snap even a single twig, slowly marshaling the men toward that churning current. She needed them to believe they had cornered her, so she allowed them the occasional fleeting sight. A dark shape slipping behind a thick trunk, a rustle in the foliage that might be her footsteps. Consumed by the chase, they followed. Vinny led the charge, spurred by the knowledge that time was against him. He growled orders over his shoulder, ignoring the doubts gnawing at him. The forest floor sloped downward, the trees thinning just enough to expose a wide, rushing river that gurgled with relentless force. The water churned, flecked with foam, and the roar echoed between rocky banks. Vinny realized too late that they had arrived at a potential dead end. He paused, scanning the opposite shore in search of a crossing. There was no sign of Naomi. He urged his two henchmen to split up along the bank, hunting for a stable path or a fallen log that might serve as a bridge. One man insisted they try to edge along the rocks, which looked passable at a glance. Vinny watched him attempt it, each step on the slick stone more precarious than the last. An uneasy dread settled over him. Naomi had chosen this location for a reason. A sudden blur of movement made him spin around, pistol at the ready. Naomi remained hidden somewhere behind the thick oak trunks, but the rush of footsteps and shouts suggested she had triggered more panic. One of Vinny's companions teetered on an algae-slick ledge, arms flailing as water sprayed up around his ankles. Vinny backed away. Another cry tore through the air as the man lost his footing. He went under with a gasp, the raging current seizing him before he could even yell for help. The swirling water carried him downstream, his desperate thrashing drowned out by the relentless surge of the river. Vinny stared, rage mingling with horror, but he made no attempt to rescue him. A heartbeat later, the man disappeared beneath the froth, leaving nothing behind but the echo of chaos. That left only one. Vinny stood rigid, chest heaving, the gun shaking in his grasp. Each exhalation tasted like failure as he realized how severely Naomi had outmaneuvered them. They had been herded to this very point, forced to choose between an impossible crossing and an exposed position. The final companion retreated from the water's edge, scanning frantically for Naomi. He fixed on a faint flicker among the trees, raised his weapon and fired. But the bullet only clipped a branch. She responded with a quick shot from an angle he could not pinpoint. Then he was on the ground, clutching his shoulder and grimacing in pain. Vinny cast one glance at his injured partner, then at the swirling river. Self-preservation took over. He bolted along the bank, ignoring the curses flung at his back. As far as he was concerned, his focus was survival, and with each pounding step, he realized that there was no easy route out of the forest. He vanished among the thick ferns and leaning trunks, leaving his bleeding companion to fend for himself. Moments later, that companion crawled away from the river, attempting to brace himself against a tree. Naomi emerged behind him, quiet as a shadow. He stared up in terror, unable to lift his gun arm. She studied him briefly, saw the futility in his eyes, and moved on without a word, certain he posed no threat. Her primary objective was Vinny, and the chase would not end until she found him. All that remained were two souls caught in a bitter game. Vinny, the last truly capable fugitive, and Naomi, the relentless hunter. The forest seemed to hold its breath. Twigs snapped in the distance where Vinny forced a path forward. Naomi started after him, senses honed to the subtlest motion. He had run out of men, run out of illusions, run out of time. She pressed on, resolute. Each stride carried her closer to the final reckoning between them, and the knowledge of that confrontation beat within her like a steady drum. Naomi Carter had tracked Vinny through a maze of broken branches and trampled ferns, always keeping him in sight just long enough to confirm his location. Each time he thought he had shaken her off, her silhouette would flicker behind a trunk or her footprints would appear in a patch of soft earth, fueling his desperation. By now, he was exhausted. The forest had taken its toll on him, with bruises covering his arms and grime caking every inch of his clothing. His breathing came in ragged bursts, and every muscle in his body felt on the verge of collapse. Yet he forced himself onward, aware that stopping would mean nothing short of surrender. Finally, a glimmer of rusted metal caught his eye through the shifting leaves. He pushed through the undergrowth and found himself at a small inlet where the river's flow slowed enough to pool. Near the muddy bank, half-sunken and coated in algae, lay a dilapidated rowboat. The sides were riddled with dents, one or looked split, but it might still float. Vinny glanced at the water, listening to its ceaseless rush. He knew that crossing the river anywhere else would be suicide, The current was far too powerful to swim. Here, though, if the boat held together, he could drift toward the opposite shore and vanish into the terrain beyond. The house they had been trying to reach lay somewhere in that direction, and if he made it alone, perhaps he could still salvage something from this doomed escape. He tugged the boat free of the mud with a hollow scraping sound, muscles protesting the effort. Every breath carried the tang of stagnant water and rotting vegetation. His eyes darted around, expecting Naomi to appear at any second, but the trilene remained still. The moment he slid the boat onto the river, relief sparked briefly in his chest. He clambered inside, gingerly testing its stability. A sharp creak made him wince, but it didn't break apart under his weight. He grabbed the one intact oar, dipped it into the murky water, and began to row, ignoring the pain that radiated through his shoulders. For several minutes, nothing emerged from the undergrowth. Vinny's heart hammered in his chest, torn between the hope that he might escape and the dread that Naomi was simply biding her time. The river's slower current in this inlet carried him away from the muddy shore with a gentle push. His breath caught when the current began to pick up, promising a swifter path downstream. He risked a backward glance, scanning the bank for any sign of pursuit. Then, in the span of a heartbeat, something moved at the very edge of his vision. Naomi vaulted from a low branch, feet skimming the water before she landed squarely on the edge of the boat, causing it to rock violently. Vinny yelped, clutching the oar as the craft lurched beneath them. She had timed her leap perfectly, and now they were both in the boat, locked in a precarious dance on the river's surface. Without hesitation, Vinny swung the oar at her head, but Naomi raised an arm to block, letting the wood slam against her forearm. Pain flared across her features, but she used the moment to snatch the oar and fling it overboard. They were adrift now, carried by the current, both unarmed except for fists and desperation. Vinny lunged, attempting to tackle her. The boat wobbled, water sloshing over the sides. Naomi twisted her body, using his momentum to drive him into the metal hull. Rusted edges screeched under the impact. He gasped, momentarily dazed, but lashed out again, catching Naomi's shoulder with a wide hook. She staggered, nearly losing her balance. The entire boat teetered, and Vinny seized the chance to push her. She stumbled and both tumbled over the side, plunging into the cold river. The shock of the current almost stole her breath, but Naomi forced herself to regain composure. Vinny clung to her waist, trying to drag her under. Water surged around them in swirling eddies, and the boat drifted away faster than either could swim. They sank briefly, spinning in the torrent, arms and legs thrashing. He latched onto her neck, pressing downward, determined to keep her submerged until she ceased struggling. For an instant, her lungs felt close to bursting. She refused to give in. Using every ounce of her strength, she twisted sideways and kicked off a submerged rock to gain leverage. Vinny's grip slipped, and she surfaced, gulping air. He emerged a moment later, blocking her path back to open water. She saw murder in his eyes. He lunged for her head, presumably hoping to dunk her again, but she seized his forearm, leveraging his weight against him. With a swift jerk, she propelled him toward the rocky shore. They slammed together in the shallows, chest deep in fast-moving water. Rolling to avoid his frantic blows, Naomi pinned Vinny's arm behind his back. He bellowed in pain, thrashing violently, so she drove him forward until his temple cracked against a jagged stone jutting above the surface. The impact reverberated through her grip, and Vinny's body went limp. Red spread through the water, visible even in the swirling currents. Panting, Naomi released him, checking if he still drew breath. His eyes fluttered, unfocused. She grabbed the collar of his drenched shirt, hauling his dead weight toward the pebbled bank. It felt as though every muscle in her own body screamed at the effort, but she refused to stop until she was clear of the water. Finally, she collapsed onto her knees, dragging Vinny's unresponsive form onto the gravel. The hum of the river was relentless, a roaring backdrop to the final act of this chase. She looked down, watching the slow rise and fall of his chest. When she pressed 2 fingers to his neck, she felt nothing. Whatever faint flicker of life he might have had faded, leaving him unmoving in her grasp. Naomi exhaled, staggering upright. Her clothes clung to her soaked frame, skin prickling in the chill breeze that drifted through the trees. She turned him onto his back, noticing how the fight had drained the last spark of defiance from his expression. Leaning in, she gazed into his lifeless eyes and spoke in a whisper, her tone hard as steel. "Never play with a predator." A shiver coursed through her as adrenaline ebbed. She studied the body for a heartbeat longer, recalling how his arrogance had first brought him to this place. Then she let go of his collar, letting the current lap at the edges of his legs. The river moved around them both, carrying away blood and fragments of broken dreams. After so many days of relentless pursuit, her ordeal had found its inevitable conclusion. She scanned the bank for any sign of other threats. None remained. One final, deep breath filled her lungs with the scent of damp earth and victory. Vinny had been the last obstacle, the final embodiment of the men who believed she was just a convenient pawn or a disposable hostage. Now he lay motionless at her feet, a cautionary tale for those who might underestimate her in the future. Naomi steadied herself, palms resting on her thighs, forcing her heartbeat to slow. She took in the swaying canopy above, each leaf shimmering with droplets of river spray. Though her limbs still trembled from exertion, a fierce sense of resolution flickered in her mind. She was no longer the pursued, she had never been, not truly. In each confrontation, she had proven that she remained the apex force in these woods, unwavering until every last threat was neutralized. Stepping away from Vinny's body, she cast one final glance at the battered rowboat bobbing downstream, half submerged. The swirling waters would soon claim it as thoroughly as it had claimed the illusions of the men who once thought they could master this terrain. A faint surge of relief mingled with lingering tension. Though she had won, the triumph felt heavy, weighted with the cost of so many lives lost along the way. Yet she knew she had done what was necessary to protect herself, to maintain the balance she had found in this remote sanctuary. Without another word, Naomi turned from the riverbank and moved into the forest, her footsteps quiet despite the rocky ground. The rustling leaves seemed to acknowledge her passing, shadows parting as she slipped back into the place that had shaped her every strategy. Whatever came next, she carried within her the unwavering certainty that she would never again be prey. In these woods, she reigned, and any who dared challenge her would learn the same bitter lesson Vinny had, just moments before he drew his final breath. Naomi Carter emerged from the forest with exhaustion etched into every muscle. Each step along the uneven ground felt like a small triumph over the blood-soaked memories she carried. The pounding of her heart had softened, replaced by a raw sense of relief. She was battered, clothes torn, arms bruised, but she was alive. The only rustling she heard now came from a breeze grazing the treetops, not the frantic chase of those who had believed she would be their easy prey. She pressed onward until dense foliage gave way to a narrow stretch of paved road. A patrol vehicle sat near the edge, lights flashing in the gloom. Two uniformed guards, alert and armed, straightened at her approach. At first, they raised their weapons, unsure of the figure stumbling from the wild. Then, taking in her ragged appearance and steady composure, they lowered their rifles. Concern and curiosity lined their faces. Naomi lifted an arm to show she held no weapon, halting a short distance away. Her voice emerged flat and calm. She explained that she had encountered 8 escaped convicts in the woods and that all of them were now neutralized. One guard's eyes widened, and the other began to question her. Naomi recounted only what was essential. They had threatened her life, and she had done what she had to do. She requested they send reinforcements to a derelict house rumored to be the convicts' rendezvous point, warning there might be supplies or further evidence there. The guards glanced at each other, both shaken by her revelation. They escorted her to their vehicle, offering a tattered blanket for her shoulders, and radioed for backup to secure the area. Inside the patrol truck, Naomi settled onto a worn seat, the drone of the engine almost soothing after the forest's perils. She gazed out the window at distant lights dancing on the horizon. Her mind drifted, replaying images of every confrontation. By the time they reached the nearest station, she was nearly too tired to speak, but a deeper resolve still pulsed in her veins. She refused any suggestion of immediate medical transport, insisting she be allowed to give her statement before fatigue claimed her. Police lights glared against dull concrete walls as she stepped inside. Officers bustled around, some with first aid kits, others snapping photos of her injuries for records. Naomi stood stoically, answering their questions with detached clarity. She described each deadly encounter with an unflinching tone, as though she were briefing a superior on a routine operation. One official, impressed by her endurance, offered the possibility of an award for valor. Another nodded, calling her actions heroic. She felt little pride in the label. The tension in her shoulders spoke louder than words. This was never about glory. The men had forced her hand, and she had responded exactly as her training dictated. She refused the notion of a medal. No plaque or ribbon could capture the grim necessity of her choices. It had not been heroism, it had been survival, fueled by a simple, immovable conviction that she would never be any man's pawn again. The officers exchanged uncertain glances, sensing that no amount of praise would alter her perspective. They asked if she wanted transport to a hospital. She shook her head, signing a last round of paperwork and turning to leave. Outside, the air felt cooler than before, carrying a faint hint of pine. Part of her yearned to vanish into that same forest, to let its hush envelop her once more. Yet she had no intention of returning to the battleground she had just escaped. She had survived its trials and emerged stronger, with every lesson etched into her bones. She paused in the parking lot, glancing back at the station's glow. Inside those walls, they might see her as a hero or a dangerous enigma. Neither role mattered. She had done what she must, ensuring no one would dare underestimate her strength again. Another car rolled in, headlights piercing the dusk. Naomi tugged the blanket tighter around her shoulders and started walking in the opposite direction, ignoring calls from an officer who seemed to realize she had no plan to stay. Her feet carried her onto a quieter road. The tension in her chest began to fade, replaced by a cautious sense of relief. She remembered every threat, every cruel word hurled her way by those convicts. It was over now. The last of them had fallen, leaving behind nothing but scattered bodies, burnt camps, and an abandoned house soon to be swarmed by authorities. The hush of her surroundings felt oddly serene, as though the forest itself acknowledged her victory. Though weariness pulled at her limbs, a new certainty guided each step. No more fear, no more doubts, and no more running from the demons of her past. She was done. She had reclaimed her quiet resolve and proven that she would never be cornered without a fight. In turning away from the station's lights, she left behind the echoes of struggle, certain that she had closed a door none would dare open again. She walked onward, leaving the silhouettes of tall pines and the faint glow of patrol vehicles behind. She had faced the darkest parts of her own determination and survived. That truth gave her more peace than any medal ever could. And as she set her gaze on a horizon unburdened by threats, she knew with unshakable confidence that she was free in every way that mattered.